Hi, my name's Phil. I'd like to talk about politics. So, Nigel Farage was spewing up words against yesterday and claimed that small business owners were robbed with Brexit because they were promised less regulation and got more. Now, promises aside, because remember, a lot of people made promises during the Brexit referendum and subsequent Article 50 process, but hardly any of them were in a position to make good on those promises. However, if anyone did promise that business would have less regulation with Brexit, they were lying. Not just because no government would actually intend to lessen regulation, because it's physically impossible. It's impossible to do anything other than increase regulation if you split up a market. And it's important to make these points to anyone you feel may be in the process of falling for these 10-year-old rotten lies again. Let us break down in simple terms how trade works and how the best way to ease regulation, indeed the only way, is to harmonise those regulations with important markets. This is why the EU CE mark is used all over the world. It's because it's much easier to make products to one set of standards rather than multiple. In other words, if businesses want easier regulation, they need us to join the single market and customs union. If that can't happen, the next best way is to harmonise all standards. Okay, so let's begin nice and simple. All markets have regulations. These regulations stipulate a range of standards, health and safety standards, environmental standards, and so on. We all want those. We all want good standards. We don't want to buy food that might kill us, do we? We don't want to buy some electrical appliance that might short circuit and kill our kids, do we? Right? So we want regulations. Regulations are the same within a market. So when we were part of the single market, our regulations were the same throughout that market. So if you were in Britain and you were selling to Ireland, the Netherlands, Greece, France, wherever, didn't matter, one set of regulations. If you had customers outside the single market, like America, for example, right, you need to understand that market's regulations as well. But as the EU single market is huge, contains much of the wealthiest customers in the world, a lot of UK businesses were able to manage a roaring trade by importing and exporting exclusively within that single market. And it was just as easy to buy from or sell to Bruges or Boulogne as it was Birmingham. But we left the EU, along with the single market and customs union. And with no need to maintain the same regulations, the UK government decided to have some differences. So now that British company, which had one set of regulations, now has two. British regulations and EU regulations. Congratulations, you've just increased regulation for businesses. And it makes not a jot of difference when Tories like Rees-Mogg or Farage talk about wanting to weaken those regulations. There are still British regulations and there are still EU regulations. Two sets of regulations to manage now. And it couldn't possibly be any other way. The only way to reduce the amount of regulation would be to harmonise with at least one major market you wish to buy from or sell to. And the maximum reduction in regulation comes from harmonising with your most important market, which for us, of course, is the EU single market. Farage claims we should not be harmonising with the EU, however. So Nigel Farage is actually suggesting that with him as Prime Minister, those small businesses are going to find themselves with even more regulation to deal with. Who will he blame for the betrayal when that happens? Or will he just claim that any business owner who complains is a woke Marxist like Boris Johnson did? But it doesn't stop there. Okay, so you now have two sets of regulations. That means your products have to meet two sets of standards if you wish to sell in both markets. That's extra work in making sure you understand those standards and making sure your product complies with both. But it's not enough to simply meet the standards of the market in which you need to sell. You've got to prove it as well. Paperwork. Or as Nigel Farage would call it, red tape. Lots of red tape to prove that you meet every one of the relevant EU standards before you can sell it in the EU. The EU single market made member states rich by actively reducing red tape. Having so many wealthy consumer nations in a single market made trade more efficient, much easier for business owners. Now, thanks to Brexit, they've got an extra set of regulations to learn and a whole heap of paperwork which just didn't exist before. And it gets better, because then we have everyone's favourite trade term, tariffs. But Boris Johnson said he'd agreed tariff-free trade with the EU. Yeah, Boris Johnson lied a bit, shocking I know. We can sell to the single market, tariff-free, if we can prove the goods meet what are called rules of origin. This means that the product had a certain percentage of it, often at least 50%, made in either the UK or the EU. That doesn't just mean components, but raw materials as well. So let's say your product was almost entirely made from materials and components in the EU or the UK. Well, you're good for tariff-free trade, right? Sure, yeah, as long as you can prove it. That means getting the paperwork together to show that enough of the product, including materials, was sourced in either market, time and money. And if you can't get the paperwork together to prove that your product meets rules of origin, then your EU customers are going to pay those import tariffs, raising the cost of your products, making them less competitive. That means you won't sell as much. Maybe not anything, because tariffs are a hassle even when the cost isn't that high. And this is going to be a particular issue with electric vehicles. The UK and EU have agreed to defer the application of tariffs until 2027. So we've been given some grace on that. But if we can't source more components in either the UK or the EU by then, our car industry could find itself slapped with tariffs that wouldn't apply if we were still in the EU. More regulations, more red tape, more costs. But this is mostly focused on businesses who need to sell to EU customers. Not all British businesses need to do that, do they? No. Some only need to buy from the EU, some neither import nor export. So what about those? Well, first of all, if the attitude is, well, let's just abandon the businesses who do need to sell to the EU and just tell them not to. Okay, you're talking about sacrificing over £370 billion worth of trade. For every bit of trade you make less, that's people losing jobs, the Treasury losing taxes. The Treasury is already at least £40 billion a year down on the deal with the already lost trade. And that's considered to be an underestimate, particularly when you take smuggling into account. Farage is proposing that we lose even more trade. So if Farage thinks we're still going to have trade with the EU, then we're still going to have to add those extra regulations. Nothing you can do about it. Can't be any other way. The EU aren't going to drop their regulations because Nigel Farage somehow got voted in based on lies and would rather the voters didn't find out about it. The only way to reduce regulations without harmonising is to stop people selling to or buying from other markets, just to say, no, you're not allowed to import, you're not allowed to export. I don't think even Farage will claim that this is what he intends. Nigel Farage as Prime Minister is not going to reduce regulations for small businesses. He's actually going to increase them. And that is because there can be no other way. But businesses who import from the EU but can sell exclusively to British customers, well, they still need to be familiar with two sets of regulations because they need to know that their EU imports meet the British standards to sell in Britain, right? So even those businesses have two sets of standards to manage, though they will have less paperwork to deal with than the exporters. As for those who neither import nor export, easy life at least for them, right? Well, it depends. One of their suppliers may have imported from the EU, so you still need to check it's fine to use in Britain. Also, you may be supplying to a customer who's going to use your product in something for sale in the EU, in which case they will want paperwork from you to prove rules of origin. So although this type of business has the least hassle from Brexit, there could still be some. But even if your small business neither buys from nor sells to the EU single market, it still exists in an economy with other businesses that do. And as I mentioned with the CE mark earlier this video, businesses like to simplify. The reason why you'll have the CE mark, even on a Japanese product being sold in America, is because it's just more efficient to do that. That means if there are businesses in their space managing British and EU regulations, because Farage forced them to, then other businesses will do it as well to be compatible with the others in their supply chain. So in reality, many small businesses are going to have to be dealing with extra regulations, even if they don't try directly with the single market, because somewhere in their supply chain, someone does. And that supply chain needs to be harmonised if it wants to trade efficiently. And the thing about small businesses, which Farage specifically mentions, is they are the most vulnerable to being outside the single market. A large business can employ a dedicated team of people to understand and implement the extra Brexit standards and extra Brexit red tape. Still extra cost, it's going to harm your trade, but the economies of scale make it at least feasible with a few exceptions. A small business cannot usually afford to pay someone just to manage the extra red tape and regulations that Farage persuaded people to vote for, so they have to do it themselves, often making mistakes or simply unable to make the economies of scale work and losing their business. This has happened a lot in the last few years. There's significantly more insolvencies per year now than in the pre-Brexit period, not counting the couple of COVID years when lots of government support propped up businesses. And this is because the EU single market actually is what reduces regulatory burden. Because people may think, well, hang on a minute, the EU regulates for high standards. It's famous for high regulation, right? Which is in our interest, by the way, because like I said, we don't want food that poisons us or electrical equipment that kills our kids, right? And but you think, well, but that's a hassle for businesses. Well, there's a reason why so many countries want to be in the EU single market, even when they don't always want to be in the EU. It actually makes it easier for their businesses. It's not regulation that's a problem for businesses. There are always regulations. It's regulatory burden, the extra time, effort, and expense a business has to go to in order to make their products fit for sale. The EU single market exists to make this process as easy as possible. In fact, they make it so easy that most businesses don't even need to lift a finger to comply. Being outside makes it more difficult. It means businesses have to suddenly be familiar with more types of regulation. They have to complete difficult paperwork. It means extra costs for things like checks at trade posts either side of the border. Oh, and if you're unlucky, the people carrying out those checks might just kick the shit out of your goods, as they seem to have been doing with plant imports in Kent. And this isn't because of the specific way the Tories or Labour have gone about trade with the EU. It's just a fact of trade. If you want to trade with a different market, that's way more hassle than trading inside your own market. Solution: expand the market to include all the countries you sell most of your stuff to. But let me know what you think in the comments below, and please subscribe to the channel for more content. Thanks for listening, and until next time, I'll see you later.